welcome to the Late Night History Talk Show. I am Elsa, and this is Sophia, and we are glad that you can join us tonight. Today, we are taking a closer look at the Women's March of Versailles during the French Revolution.
On October 5th, 1789, a large crowd of women, including soldiers and men, were seen marching from Paris to the royal palace of Versailles, demanding for more bread and lower costs, and more importantly, the fate of the royal family. However, before we dig deeper into this event, let's briefly talk about its background.
The storming of the Bastille, which occurred in July 1789, was one of the many highlights of the French Revolution. It happened just 3 months before the Women's March. To the revolutionaries, the past event was a source of confidence because it was relatively successful. The military leader Delaunay surrendered the Bastille and the revolutionaries took control. Flush with newly discovered power, the commoners of France, particularly those in Paris, felt a newly discovered desire to participate in politics and government errands.
Another event that's worth mentioning are the bread riots, or the Flour War. They lasted for 2 months in 1775, and it was also caused by poor harvest problems and the wealthy intentionally lifting prices of bread and selling it to the needy. It sparked the ideas of revolts and an increase of resentment towards the government.
A lot of people ask why Versailles was chosen. Sophia, could you explain?
Sure. Since the 1600s, the Versailles symbolized the absolute reign of the French royal government. Adding on to that, the Palace of Versailles was the royal seat of power, and it was where King Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and their 2 children were in residence. The women wanted the king to leave Versailles and return to Paris, where he would be away from what they perceived as the corrupting influences of the aristocracy.
Ah, I see. Hope this resolved some of your inquiries. Also, a common food for citizens at the time was bread. It required a lot of flour to make, however, which by some miraculous coincidence was in shortage. Women of Paris went to the market to buy bread for their families, only to find that little bread was available and were reaching ridiculously high prices. The Third Estate couldn't afford bread, which was already the cheapest thing to eat.
Well, no wonder everyone hated the queen for saying, "Let them eat cake."
Hence, price inflation and severe food shortages in Paris became commonplace, as did local incidents of violence in the marketplaces.
Seeing all of these problems arise, family guy King Louis XVI was devastated and called for a meeting of the Estates General in May 1789 in an attempt to solve the famine problems. After much discussion, however, the Third Estate broke away and declared themselves to be the National Assembly.
Moreover, rumors of the Paxi famine were rampant and readily believed. Women selling fish in wet markets were gossiping that the greedy merchants were inflating prices, which was true as seen during the Flour War. The bishops were hoarding the grain. The king had ordered that the people of France starve as a punishment for the National Assembly. Debatable, really. This provoked the great fear in the summer of 1789.
Phew, and that's a wrap for the background. After the short break, we will be back with Hane. She will then have a recap of exactly what happened on that day.
On the morning of October 5th, 1789, one of the starters of the October March, the One de Miracle, convened a march in a Paris marketplace. A large group of women wanted to buy bread for their families, but found them too expensive and scarce, so they marched with the One through Paris demanding for more bread at a fair price. As time went by, more people, including men, joined the group, and soon there were thousands of protesters. The crowd took over the Hôtel de Ville and got some bread and weapons. Some suggested they head to the palace in Versailles and confront King Louis XVI.
We will march into Versailles to demand the king to listen to the people. Bread! Bread!
We will bring the baker and the baker's wife and the baker's boy. Bread!
They addressed the king as the baker, the queen as the baker's wife, and their children the baker's boy.
Let's march with the women of Paris to Versailles as a matter of honor. The cause that we fought for is lost, and we fight for what you want.
Tomorrow, things will be better because we will be in charge.
We are here! 6 hours in the rain, and now we are before the palace of Versailles! We demand to see the baker! Yes, the baker! See the baker! See the baker! See the baker!
The royal guards invited the women and Stanislas Mary Millard to meet the king.
We have come to Versailles to demand for more food and to request punishment to the royal bodyguards who have insulted the patriotic cockade during the royal banquet.
We need food! We need food! Don't you have enough food?
We don't have enough food. How can we afford bread when it costs 14 and a half sous?
It costs 90% of my husband's wage! I can't afford feeding my family!
The people of France are starving.
My people, I will alleviate the food shortages in Paris.
What? Just this? We need more action from you, baker!
We hope that you can provide us more food.
Fine. Then I will give you all the food in my stores, and I will promise you more in the future. Now, please excuse me.
We will never give up until all of us can eat as much as we want!
The crowd demanded to meet the king when they reached the palace. A few women met with him, and he agreed to provide them food from his stores and more in the future. To prevent a carnage, the king addressed the crowd from a balcony, despite a regiment of the National Guard having arrived from Paris. After the agreement, but many stayed and continued to protest.
There are still a lot of dissenters. Marquis de Lafayette and a regiment of the National Guard have arrived from Paris. Would you like them to restore order?
No, they're waiting for us. I will talk to them. My people, I will endorse the Assembly's reformist legislation and give my assent to the August decrees and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen.
Early in the next morning,
We can never trust a foreigner! No! The baker said will be reversed by costing what? Let's kill the baker's wife!
some of the crowd got into the palace in an attempt to kill the queen. Fighting broke out, and at least 2 guards were killed. The queen was safe. Eventually, peace was restored by Marquis de Lafayette.
Your Majesty, there are still nuisance outside. You must appear on the balcony now. If not, we cannot control them.
Look, there's no one there. The king has fled to Austria.
No, Louis, don't go. They'll kill you.
Your Majesty, I believe they don't wish to harm you. It is best for you to address them on your balcony now.
I will do as you say. Give me my tricolor card.
Return to Paris with us.
My people, I shall go with you to Paris. It is to my good and faithful subjects that I confide all that is precious to me.
We want to see the baker's wife! Where is the Austrian woman? She has already fled!
The baker's wife now. We are poor because of her. She's lavish. We are suffering and we need bread. And you are here spending all our hard-earned money. Kill her! Kill her! Get her children!
He agreed to travel back to Paris with the revolutionaries. The crowd then demanded to see Queen Marie Antoinette, who many blamed their province on along with her extravagant spendings. Some attempted to take her children away and even kill her. However, Lafayette knelt before the Queen and kissed her hand, and so she was allowed to live. Afterwards, the royal family traveled back to Paris with the crowd. By this time, the crowd had grown from around 7,000 marchers to 60,000. The king went to live at the Tuileries Palace in Paris. Little did he know he would never again return to his beautiful palace in Versailles. After an overview of what happened during the course of the Women's March of Versailles, let us hear about the causes and impacts of this event.
Thank you, Hane. After her rundown, we can start diving deeper into the causes and impacts of the Women's March on the Versailles.
We're honored to have our guests, Eunice and Crystal, both well-known French history analysts with us today.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me on the show.
Hello, it is an honor to be here.
We talked about how the women of Paris couldn't afford to buy the expensive bread on the markets for their families, and there was even a bread riot. Professors, are there any reasons why this occurred?
There are three main causes. Firstly, demographic changes in the 18th century placed pressures on farmers. The population of France grew by 8 million in just 80 years. This caused the number of residents in cities and towns to increase. A good example would be Paris. It had an increase of 1,500,000 people.
Agricultural productivity failed to keep pace with this population growth. Production increased by 10 to 20% in some regions, but hardly or even a decrease in others. In 1775, American politician and diplomat John Adams toured parts of rural France and wrote,
"The country is a heap of ashes. Grass is scarcely to be seen and all sorts of grain is short, thin, pale and feeble, while the flax is quite deal. I pity these people from my soul. No green peas, no salad, no vegetables to be had upon the road. The flocks of sheep and herds of cattle stalk about the fields like droves of walking skeletons."
In short, France had 8 million more mouths to feed, but its farmers and farmland have failed to increase their yields to do so.
Moreover, France was ruled according to the ancient regime. It was an unjust system, with heavy burdens such as growing the nation's food and paying taxes, crushing the peasants and farmers from the Third Estate. They could not afford the expensive bread after paying the high taxes.
Furthermore, despite bread being one of the main food sources, it was quite scarce. France endured a lot of unfortunate weather events during that period of time. A gigantic hailstorm, a harsh winter in 1788, famines, frosts, droughts, and floods, which caused disruption to the economy and of course the environment too, for the land was less productive than before.
Under the frequent crises, commoners were then even more incapable of producing food, or even affording it, as the bread prices again rose higher, up to 14.5 sous.
Last but not least, some people prioritized their own personal gain over the lives of the people of France. They hoarded most of the grains and sold them to the needy at unreasonably high prices just to draw water to their own mill. While they obtained massive profits, the people of France were starving and dying.
In my opinion, the march was their last resort. They were basically fighting for their own lives. Riots and revolts were probably their only option to express their discontent towards the government.
That's a very well elaborated point. Well, our audience is wondering whether the march was planned or not. Professors, do you have any insight on this?
Despite its post-revolutionary mythology, the march was not a spontaneous event. The unjust ancient regime caused a lot of public discontent and criticism towards the government.
Also, speakers at the Palais Royal, known as the Palace of Equality during the Revolutionary period, mentioned the idea of a march regularly, and it had been widespread among the people long before it happened.
Though most of the protesters in the march had peaceful intentions, some marchers had more violent intentions, seeking retribution against the king's soldiers and his wife.
Oh, I've heard that the queen was especially hated and despised, right?
It was believed her lavish spending had contributed to the country's financial troubles. Hence, she was nicknamed by the people as Madame Deficit.
Oh, I get it now. Thank you very much for your insight.
I've heard that there are several other causes except for the aforementioned points.
Yes, there was a final trigger, a royal banquet held on October 1st. Let's watch an reenactment of exactly what happened during that time.
Welcome, everyone, to the welcoming banquet for the new officers.
Entendre, entendre. Long live the king.
Feast on, my soldiers. We have a plethora of meat and bread, wine for days.
3 hours later.
I solemnly swear that I am up to no good. I pledge allegiance to the House of Bourbon! Yet only to the House of Bourbon!
Well, the reenactment is pretty self-explanatory.
The royal banquet was held as the officers at Versailles were welcoming the officers of new troops, a customary practice when a unit changed its garrison. The royal family briefly attended the event. The lavish banquet was reported in the news as nothing short of a gluttonous orgy.
Worst of all, the papers dwelt scornfully on the reputed desecration of the tricolor cockade. Drunken officers were said to have stamped upon this prestigious symbol of the nation, and professed their allegiance solely to the white cockade of the House of Bourbon, which represented only the nobility.
The tricolor cockade was very important as it represented all three estates. The white cockade defeats the whole purpose of it.
Hence, this embellished tale of the royal banquet became the source of intense public outrage.
I believe this is about it.
Huge thanks to Eunice and Crystal for sharing our insights. No one would have thought that what seemed to have been a normal royal banquet could lead to such an outbreak of events.
After a short advertisement, we'll be back to talk about the impact of the Women's March on Versailles. Stick around so you won't miss out.
Now let's move on to the impacts. Why did the Women's March play such a significant role in the French Revolution?
The march became a rallying point through the next stages of the revolution. Lafayette eventually attempted to leave France, as many thought that he'd been too soft on the royal family. He was imprisoned and only released by Napoleon in 1797. Maillard remained a hero, but he died in 1794 at age 31.
The Women's March also gave power and confidence to the people to revolt the political system, making it so significant. They were willing to take part in protest. As we can see from the video, the king and the queen left from Versailles to Paris by demand. The march's success in forcing the king to move to Paris and support the reforms was a major turning point in the French Revolution.
As mentioned, the Versailles symbolized the complete rule of the king. The moving symbolizes the change of power and radical reforms that were about to happen.
Their invasion of the palace removed all doubts that the monarchy was subjected to the will of the people and was a major defeat for France's ancient regime of hereditary monarchy. The women who initiated the march were heroines, called Mothers of the Nation.
Exactly. Adding on to that, other women were rioting because of the high price and scarcity of bread. The commotions and its causes quickly became closely intertwined with the activities of the revolutions.
Additionally, the Women's March forever transformed the role of women in revolution and what political gains they could expect for themselves. It was the first protest march of women in modern history.
The Women's March on Versailles struck a conversation pertaining to women's rights beyond traditional roles in the household setting. 1 month after the extraordinary success, they would present to the new National Assembly a groundbreaking demand for gender equality. Despite the leaders of the revolution not extending natural rights to women, their attempt on achieving gender equality is much respected.
The protesting grandmothers, daughters, and mothers have the unique power to do what male protesters cannot, such as break through a line of National Guard bayonets without being fired upon. Up till this day, female activism during the Women's March on Versailles has influenced and inspired other women in history to go on streets to protest and fight for their rights. For example, in February 21st of 2017, the Women's March on Washington drew an estimated 500,000 people to the flagship march in Washington, with officials reporting that marches took place on all 7 continents in 673 places worldwide, totaling an estimated 5 million participants worldwide to fight for reproductive rights, LGBTQIA rights, workers' rights, civil rights, disability rights, immigrants' rights, and environmental justice. The Women's March on Versailles is often compared to the Women's March on Washington by historians.
Okay, so it was like a sign of success, and it brought hope to the people of France, right? Anything you'd like to add?
Another interesting impact that the march brought was that the monarchist faction in the Assembly lost its significance. For the women of Paris, the march was the climax of the revolution. The royals and the court were trapped in Paris, which forcefully crippled the resistance to the call from the reformers.
The first French constitution was passed in 1791. For those who are not sure what this is, it signifies a constitutional monarchy. Power, instead of being concentrated in the hands of the king, was now separated and assigned to different institutions. For example, the legislature, executive, and the judiciary. This again reinforces a belief that the Women's March reduced the significance of the monarchist faction in the assembly.
Thank you, Eunice and Crystal, for joining us tonight and sharing their perceptive analysis with us. Don't forget to tune in next time for another episode where we will talk more about the French Revolution. Goodbye for now.
Audio